And welcome, Hoosier fans, to another episode of Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana University basketball news and discussion. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Podcast on the Brink is a joint production of the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. For complete coverage of IU basketball, visit assemblycall.com and insidethehall.com. On this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink, we were joined by Robert Abbott, the filmmaker behind the film The Last Days of Night, which recently premiered on ESPN+. This is a movie that I was initially skeptical about, but decided to give it a chance. And I'm really glad I did. I found it very thought-provoking, very interesting, and we have a wide-ranging conversation with Robert about the film. We talk with him about the difference in reaction among IU fans and non-IU fans, why players seem to have such different reactions to playing for Bob Knight, whether he thinks Neil Reed would have wanted this story told again, that and much more coming on this discussion with Robert Abbott on Podcast on the Brink. Buying tickets can be complicated and confusing, but there is a better way to buy with SeatGeek. SeatGeek is the smartest, easiest way to get tickets to every type of live event. Whether you're searching for a last-minute deal, planning a night out with friends, or need to find the perfect gift, SeatGeek helps you find the best seats at the best prices, fully guaranteed. There is nothing quite like being there in person, and SeatGeek will get you closer to the action for a great value. I have the SeatGeek app on my phone, have had it for a couple of years now, and it is by far the easiest way that I have found to shop for tickets because I can be anywhere, and with just a few taps, I can instantly find seats. I would love to use the SeatGeek app to pick up Mavericks playoff tickets this year and see Yogi, but obviously the Mavericks are not in the playoffs. But if you're in Indiana and you want to watch Victor, you want to watch Eric Gordon with Houston, or you want to watch OG with Toronto, or any other NBA playoff games, or any baseball games during the summer, SeatGeek is the way to go because SeatGeek is designed to make your ticket buying experience easier than ever. SeatGeek saves you time and money by searching multiple ticket sites to compare prices and find amazing deals so that you don't have to go through all that legwork yourself. And best of all, listeners to Podcast on the Brink, like you, get $20 off of your first SeatGeek purchase. All you have to do is download the SeatGeek app and enter the promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, today. That is promo code BRINK for $20 off of your first SeatGeek purchase. Our guest this week on Podcast on the Brink is journalist and filmmaker Robert Abbott. He is the man behind Field of Screams, Catholics versus Convicts, and of course, The Last Days of Night, which recently premiered on ESPN's new streaming service, ESPN+. Robert, welcome to the show, and thank you for taking the time to chat with us today.
Guys, thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
So, before we go any further, I do want to let everybody who's listening know that you can watch The Last Days of Night without having to pay. Because when you register for ESPN Plus, you do get a free 30-day trial. And I know I've seen a few people on Twitter and elsewhere say they don't want to have to pay to see it. And that's no longer an excuse. You can watch it without having to pay. And, Robert, I want to open by suggesting to everyone listening, and obviously the vast majority of people listening to this are probably diehard IU basketball fans, I just want to recommend that you do watch The Last Days of Night, because I'll admit that I was initially skeptical, even said that I wasn't really interested in watching it, just because I've grown so tired of talking about and hearing about Bob Knight, revisiting all the antics and hearing all of his current bitterness. But Robert, I think you did a really nice job of telling the story in a compelling way, and it really shed new light on a dark chapter in IU basketball history for me that I even lived through as a student. And I really wasn't expecting that. And so I'm kind of curious, what has the general response to the film been from IU fans, and has it differed greatly from how non-IU fans have reacted to it?
I think for non-IU fans, it's been fairly across the board, very, very positive. It's even surprised me. I knew it was a really powerful and strong film, but you never know when you get too close to something. But as far as IU fans, I think your reaction is probably very similar to a lot of other IU fans. is this going to be the same old thing? Is somebody taking shots at Coach Knight? Are they trashing him? Is it a hatchet job? Am I going to learn anything new? And for me, I have to give all the credit to John Dahl at ESPN Films. The film was not my idea. I did not pitch this film. A few years ago, I pitched Catholics versus Convicts. It's the film I wanted to direct about the Miami Notre Dame game in 1988, the football game. And he asked if he could give that to another director who went to Notre Dame. And I was kind of frustrated at the time. And he said, don't worry about it. I want you to tell the Bob Knight story. And I'm like, I want to tell the Catholics versus Convicts one. And he convinced me that these films are better when the director has a specific point of view. And that doesn't mean, for me, it doesn't mean as a journalist, it's going to be one-sided. John just kept harping on me, tell your story. And that's what I did. And I'm glad that someone who was skeptical like yourself enjoyed it. And I would ask you, what surprised you about the film? What were your expectations going in? And then how did they change as you watched it?
I think, I think there were some details about how everything was handled that I didn't really know. And, for me at that time as a student, I was very much awash in the idolatry of Bob Knight that a lot of other people were. And my perspective on that has changed a lot since then. My perspective now is much different than student me had. And I'll tell you the other thing about it that I wasn't expecting that I really appreciated. Number one was your perspective, the way the story was told. It was different than what I thought going in, and that made it compelling. But I was also really appreciative of the fact that Neil Reed's story was told more, because he's a guy that, when he got to Indiana, I was such a big fan of his, really enjoyed watching him play. And it really feels like his kind of legacy as a Hoosier and his memory has been tarnished somewhat in the aftermath of how everything went down. And I just thought the way that you told his story and humanized him and updated everybody on what his life was like after that, that was difficult to watch, compelling to watch, emotional to watch. And I think as I've talked with other Indiana fans who have watched it, that's been kind of the common theme, is just being really appreciative of learning more about Neil, how it all came about, and kind of what transpired with him after that.
Yeah, actually, my boss, Steve Robinson, who's in the film, it's a soundbite that didn't make it, but he often, in one of my interviews with him, he said, oftentimes when someone does an investigation, somebody makes a phone call, where the phone will ring at the New York Times or somewhere and say, hey, did you know this? That's not what happened in this case at all. And in fact, it wasn't an investigation. 3 high school All-Americans, 3 McDonald's All-Americans left IU, as you know, in the span of about 2.5 years. First was Neil Reed after 97 season. Then half a season later, it was Jason Collier right after the new year. And then at the end of the following season, it was Luke Recker. And when Luke left, that's when my boss, Steve Robinson, called me into his office and said, hey, 3 kids have left there, really good players. A lot of times you'll have malcontents on the end of the bench leaving or prima donnas leaving, and none of these kids seem to fit the bill as a bad apple, right? They were all great kids, and that's something I can tell you after covering the story for 17 months back then and doing it again for 2 years now. There were great kids that went to Indiana. I did not talk to on the phone a punk or anyone like that. So Knight was recruiting really good kids. And so my boss said, go find out what's going on. We actually thought it was going to be more about AAU basketball and society. Back in the 90s, a lot of athletes had a sense of entitlement, right? Coming out of high school, you got a big name, you got a big head, you go to college and you don't want to listen to the coach. That's really what we thought the story would be about. And it wasn't until I talked to Neil and he told me some of the things that went on. I talked to him probably for an hour and a half that first night, and he didn't want to go on camera. He didn't want to do it. And we talked on and off probably once a week for about nine months before he was finally willing to go on camera. So it's not a situation where Neil called me. No one in Indiana called me. It was just my boss saying, why are good players leaving Bob Knight's program?
So Robert, your boss calls you in, and obviously for those who haven't seen the film yet, some of this is covered in the film, but I'm just curious from a reporting perspective. Your boss calls you in, tells you, this is a story we want to pursue. I don't know if you can remember back to the first thing you did, but how do you attack that? I know you mentioned talking to Neil Reed, but what other things were you doing in that time frame to try to really get to the bottom of this? Because you mentioned it went in a different direction than you originally thought.
You basically start doing research. I print out some rosters. I find out the 3 kids who left. I start reading as much as I can on each of those kids. Again, is there some underlying situation? Guy like Larry Bird back in the day left, but it had to do with his father and being homesick and the death of his father. You try to find out what's in their background. And the more I looked and the more I read over the first few days, I was like, God, it looks like Neil Reed was kind of born to play there. Looks like Luke Recker, he's a Mr. Indiana. They're idolized there. He signed, I think, after his junior season or at the beginning of his junior season to go there. So it kind of reinforced what my boss was thinking, that why are these kids leaving? There was no red flag. There was no simple red flag where you could discount their stories. And Jason Collier, I believe, was Mr. Ohio basketball, a big 7-footer. Everybody in the country wanted him. So I started printing out rosters. I started reading on their background. How were they performing? Were there any incidents with the coach there? What's happened since then? Because, again, Neil Reed had been gone for the better part of 2 years by now. Where did he go? Did he go to Southern Miss? Is there anything negative on him there? You just start kind of doing a character study of each of the kids. And that's where it began. I began with the media guides, the rosters, and then I start calling people.
So you mentioned you talked to Neil Reed for 9 months, and that's how long it took you to actually get him to agree to do something on camera. Recalling those conversations, was there a sense from your perspective that he was afraid to talk, or he just didn't want to talk from the standpoint of bringing up old wounds? Because the thing that really I think is really striking later in the film, when you go back to kind of tell the story and you go back and watch just kind of his facial expressions when he goes back to watch the video, you can kind of see those old wounds open back up. But from your perspective, what were maybe the primary reasons that he didn't necessarily want to talk? And was there anything that surprised you as you got to know him and got to talk to him over that time period?
I think it was a little bit of everything you said. I think part of him didn't want to open the old wounds. Another part of him was fear. I mentioned it in the film. People were afraid. People were afraid that Coach Knight could impact your career. And Neil, at the time, was debating whether to play basketball again. And then he got a phone call, I want to say on a Saturday, and next thing you know, on a Monday, he was flying to Holland to play for a team in Holland. So when that happened, I knew he wasn't going to talk, because he had told me, even agents I spoke to in Europe had talked to me about, the long arm of Coach Knight. That if Coach Knight puts word out on you, good or bad, you're kind of labeled with that. So nobody wanted to get on Coach Knight's bad side. So there was a bunch of fear, and I didn't necessarily convince Neil Reed to talk to me. I was probably more of a therapist. I just listened. And I think I was just waiting until he was ready, is probably a more apt description. I kept calling him, staying in touch with him. We talked about a lot of other things other than basketball. It wasn't just talking about IU basketball every time. During this time, I got married. I went on my honeymoon. I called him from my honeymoon. He's like, where are you going? We just kept talking. And the more you talk to someone, the more relaxed they are with you. And the more relaxed they are with you, the more they tell you things. And then the more they trust you. And I think one of the big things is I talked to a lot of players over a long period of time, 9-10 months. And I never reported a word of what they said. And that's because I promised them I'm not going to put you out there by yourself. And that's rare, especially in this day and age. The second you get a soundbite, the second you get an accusation, the second you get an allegation, it's on the news, 5 minutes later, 30 minutes later. And I knew for the story to hold up, we would have to get numerous people to verify what each other were saying. And there's a process in that. And as a journalist, I don't put words into people's mouth. I don't say, did you see Coach Knight choke Neil Reed? I said, did you ever see an incident between them? Did they ever have any problems? And I want them to use words that they're choosing, not ones I'm choosing. And when they started choosing the same words as other teammates, I started saying, wait a second, I think there's something here. They're telling me the same story. They're describing it in the same manner. I think there's a story here. But still, none of them wanted to go on camera because they were afraid.
You know, Robert, the thing that is so confounding and even confusing about Bob Knight and his time at Indiana is, you know, you've got guys like Neil Reed and Luke Recker and Jason Collier that really struggled with the experience and obviously left. But then there were guys, you know, contemporaries of these players, you know, A.J. Guyton, Michael Lewis, who were in the film, Kirk Haston, who played with those guys and, you know, wrote a book called Days of Night, where he, you know, lays out the many ways that Bob Knight had a positive influence on his life. Why do you think such a dichotomy exists? Why did some players, you know, like Neil and Jason and Luke seem kind of scarred by the experience and other guys seem to flourish in it?
I think their experiences are a little closer than the other players convey. I got a phone call the night the film debuted on ESPN Plus from a player. I got a text, and then we talked the next day. And he started describing players who fall into the list that you're talking about, that on the surface, they had great experiences. And this player told me so-and-so, so-and-so. And again, it's an off-the-record conversation. I don't want to reveal their names. But this player said there were all these guys had issues with Coach Knight at one time or another. All of them wanted to quit at one time or another. Even Steve Alford would get thrown out of practice, don't come back, don't get on the plane. They all had that experience. I think what happened was in the late 90s, this is from my reporting, is they weren't winning as much, and winning goes a long way. Bob Lee has a bite in the piece. He says winning cures a lot of things, right? And coach dropping a couple of F-bombs isn't going to matter if you're winning. So if Coach Knight pushed Scott May, Quinn Buckner, Kirk Haston, or some of the guys in the 70s and 80s to their brink, but you're winning. And I think earlier in his career, I think he had that sense of, I got to put my arm around this kid or I'm going to lose him. I got to pat this kid on the butt or I'm going to lose him. I got to give him something positive or I'm going to lose him. I think in the 90s when my coach asked me to look into it, I don't think he had that governor. I don't think he had that sense anymore, whether it was the kids were different or Coach Knight hadn't changed or the losing was getting to him. I just don't think. I think he pushed him beyond the brink, and that's why these good kids left. But you can ask some of Knight's best players, and there's times where all of them wanted to quit.
Yeah.
A couple of players told me that almost all of them that I talked to in that mid to late 90s era, they said, I dreaded going to practice. I hated it. The common thread between Luke, Neil Reed, and Jason was they didn't love basketball anymore while playing there, and that's sad. These are kids that, from there, you saw from Neil Reed, he dreamed of playing for Coach Knight from when he was 8 years old on, right? Luke Recker's Mr. Indiana. My dream is to play at IU and wear the candy striped sweats. And all of a sudden, you don't want to go to practice. You don't want to play. I had a number of people, and you can go back and look because there's a reference to it, I believe, in a Terry Hutchins article. I don't know if it was after Colorado game or one of the games where they were bounced in the first round, where I know on the phone players referred to the end of the season that they'd get to the NCAA tournament and they didn't care if they lost because that meant they didn't have to go back to practice the next day. And I found that very sad and tragic, that they wanted to win. But you know what? If you lost, hey, I don't have to go to practice and put up with it anymore. And that's, I think, the difference.
It certainly does help explain some of the really poor performances that we saw in the NCAA tournament in those years.
Yeah, they were one and done 3 years in a row, and they were out in the second round, and they didn't seem to have that. I referenced it in the Pepperdine game.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think Coach Knight broke the spirit of his teams, and they had nothing left to give come the tournament. That's the line in the film. He broke the spirit of his teams and had nothing left to give come the tournament. And I think earlier in his career, he gave them just enough, right? Hey, it is for your better. It is for your growth. But I think if you listen to the tirade, the famous tirade that was recorded in 1991,
mm-hmm.
listen to it again. And anybody who watches the film, if you watch it again or you're watching it for the first time, don't listen to the F-bombs and the GDs and the S-words and all the profanity that's bleeped out and starred out, and listen to the I's and me's. And it really became about I and me. I'm tired of losing to Purdue. You're not going to put me in that situation again. The more I listen to it, I'm like, Coach, do you think they're upset with losing to Purdue? Do you think they're tired of going 8-10 in, the Big Ten? And I think towards the end of his career, it became, he blamed the players for the poor performance. It can't be me. I've won 3 national titles and an Olympic gold medal. It's got to be you guys. And after you're beaten down like that enough, you kind of roll over in the tournament or you leave.
It's obvious that a lot of things went wrong for the end of his tenure to be this spectacular dumpster fire that it became. And a lot of people are at fault for that. Knight, obviously, at fault for all of his antics. I think, your film lays out how the administration was at fault, for enabling him for a long time, for how they handled the end. I'm curious if you assign any blame to the following 2 parties for how things ended: the local media or IU fans for the part that they played in encouraging the mythologizing of Knight, for overlooking or apologizing for his antics, especially because of the winning, and kind of creating this larger than life figure that he became.
It's a great question. I'm not here to assess blame as a journalist, but you make a good point. And it's not what I hope people who watch the film take from it. This isn't just particular to Bob Knight and IU. IU's a great school. As you see, I interviewed John Walden and Terry Klapex in the film. They're the only 2 people still alive who were in the room to watch the Neil Reed tape with me. Frederick Eichhorn and Christopher Simpson have passed away. Miles Brand's passed away. So I have the utmost respect that they sat down with me, and I'm actually very friendly with them, and I have a great relationship with them, and we just talked about it. So the local media, it happens anywhere. I went to Florida State University. You see it in the film. I graduated in 1986. I remember being in a journalism class where we were talking about being a journalist in a local hometown sports team. And at the time, Bobby Bowden, Florida State went on his run of 14 straight top 4 finishes right after this. But I said, really? We're having this ethical conversation. I said, if you live here in Tallahassee, Florida, and you have a wife and kids, and you hear the story that's going to put the football program in a really bad spot, you have to be tremendously courageous to report that. And I was just a kid at the time, but I knew how difficult that was, even as a student, that you live in Bloomington. If you report negatively on Coach Knight, you don't get access. You don't get access, your job's harder. The guy at the other station is going to beat you every night of the week. So it fosters, whether it's in Alabama and it's Nick Saban, or it's Duke and it's Mike Krzyzewski, or you name the town, you name the legend, there is some culpability to the local media. And oftentimes it takes somebody from the outside, like myself. I wasn't in Bloomington. I didn't follow the Big Ten. I just came in from the outside and said, why are these 3 kids leaving? And I asked some logical questions. And the fans are going to be the fans. Let's be honest. This story is it's as much about power and the abuse of power and how much as fans we see a sense of ourselves or feel a sense of ourselves in the success of our teams. I was talking to somebody at Turner Sports in the last year, and we talked about we're all part of tribes. I'm part of the Florida State tribe. I like the Miami Dolphins. I follow the Philadelphia Flyers. And these are all my teams. And you don't want to hear the negative on your team. And when your team wins, you feel good about yourself. And when your team loses, you're kind of frustrated. So when you ask about the local media and the fans, the local media has a really tough job to do to call it like it is, especially for somebody as intimidating as Coach Knight. And the fans, you know, sadly, IU hasn't won as much since Coach Knight left. And a lot of fans probably want him back for the winning, but do you want to put up with the stuff that was happening behind the scenes? So there is some blame to go around with both groups, but it's not Bloomington, it's not IU, it's not the Big Ten, it's everywhere. It's everywhere.
Robert, I think it's pretty well established that Knight, some of his tactics wouldn't, happen or be accepted in today's world of college basketball. But I'm curious if you've ever done any research or if you dug into at all how Knight kind of adopted a lot of the things that he did. I mean, is it something that was like that predates his time at Indiana? Is there anything that you can look to or point to in his past that says this is kind of how he came up with these methods? I know a lot of people will maybe say, going back to his Army background at West Point, but I'm just kind of curious if you looked into that at all and kind of the origin of maybe where some of these things that he did, his tactics came from.
And that's a great question, because yes, I did. It didn't ultimately make the film because the film wasn't necessarily a biography on Coach Knight, but some of my phone calls dated back to the 1960s when he was at West Point. And there's a bite in the film from Dave Kindred, who said, you don't coach at Indiana in 2000 like you did West Point in 65. When he's coaching at West Point, his players, after they graduate, are in the Army and probably headed to Vietnam. It's a life and death situation. And so much of his tactics of breaking individuals down, you kind of push them to their breaking point and then you mold them into who you want. That's very much a militaristic mentality. And there's nothing wrong with that at the time, right? There's nothing wrong with that in 1965. But that doesn't work in the 1990s when high school kids are looking at the Fab Five and the baggy shorts and the black socks and the showboating and the way they run up and down the court. So he was also a fan of Woody Hayes, Claire B. I mean, he modeled his coaching style after some pretty influential people in sports. He was very good friends with Bill Parcells at West Point. Parcells is a hard ass. He's demanding. I actually did the Sports Century on him and learned a lot about him. And players would tell me that Bill Parcells would always say, pressure bursts pipes. I want to put so much pressure on you in practice that come the fourth quarter on a Sunday afternoon, you're going to think it's easy. And Coach Knight had that same mentality. But again, I think in the 70s and 80s, society put up with it a little more. We were a little more tolerant of it. But in the mid to late 90s, don't just blame society. That's where I thought Coach Knight was brilliant. I'm like, how could he see he wasn't adapting? One thing you guys haven't brought up is recruiting. I don't think he was recruiting as hard. I really don't. I think back in the day, he would go get the best players, and I think later he left it up to his assistant coaches. So I think the combination of having a little bit less talent to work with, and then he pushes 3 McDonald's All-Americans to the brink where they all leave, all of a sudden you're left with a roster that is, undermanned. And I had a conversation the other day with somebody who we were talking about X's and O's versus Joes, right? What do you want? Do you want the coach who can coach X's and O's, or do you want the Joes, in this case, the Fab Five? And Knight was successful against the Fab Five, but who went to the final, right? Knight beat the Fab Five. He out-X'd and O'd him several times, but ultimately the Joes are going to win out in this day and age.
I'm curious, Robert, during the course of your reporting, both of the original story and then revisiting it for this documentary, What was the most surprisingly positive thing that you learned about Coach Knight?
I just think I think the bite early in the film, and for people who watch it, pay attention to the second soundbite from Dick Vitale. He said he has the heart of gold for people he admires, for people he loves, and for people he respects. And there's no truer word said in the film than that. I think the difference is if he doesn't admire, love, or respect you, he becomes Mr. Hyde. You know, he does have a heart of gold. Dick Vitale told me the story where he was up for the Hall of Fame, and Bob Knight said, "You're not going to get in the Hall of Fame, but I've asked every living member of the Hall of Fame to write a letter on your behalf and send it to the Hall." He goes, "You're not going to get in this year, Dick, but you're going to have those letters, and that's going to be your Hall of Fame. That's going to be it." And actually, Dick Vitale showed me the letter from John Wooden that he wrote on his behalf. And ironically, Dick Vitale did get in the Hall of Fame. Coach Knight didn't have to do that. He didn't have to do that. He didn't have to do what he did with Landon Turner. I think when he loves, admires, and respects you, there's probably no more loyal person in sports than Coach Knight. The problem is, if you leave like Luke Recker and you're in a horrific automobile accident 6 months later, or whatever the time period was, he never sent Luke a card and never made a call. And I talked back then, and Luke's mom said that he never got anything from Coach Knight, and other coaches in the Big Ten reached out. And that hurt. That hurt. And so I sit there and I say, what's the difference between Landon Turner and Luke Recker? One left, the other didn't. And when you leave, you're leaving the family. And it's persona non grata really for the rest of your life.
Do you think at all that there is a contradiction in the fact that ESPN made, this 30 for 30 with full knowledge of Knight's career and his indiscretions and all of that, but then also employed him for 7+ years as a broadcaster?
I don't think so. There's two different ways you can look at it. I know a lot of people are looking at it that way. I worked, in full disclosure, after I did the story with CNN, I worked at ESPN for 11 years. I've since been on my own doing films for the past 5 years, 6 years. I actually commend ESPN for having the guts to do it, right? Like, not a lot of people would do it. I know ESPN is under fire a lot, but, no knock against the other organizations I'm going to mention, but, what kind of news is Fox breaking? What kind of news is NBC Sports, CBS Sports, all the other networks, TNT, they televise games. I think the challenge with ESPN, I've had this conversation a number of times with people, when CBS had, who was on 2.5 Men from the baseball film. I can't think of his name right now. He's the highest paid guy in Hollywood. You don't mix CBS Sports with CBS Entertainment and CBS News, right? You may have some questionable programming on here, but then you have your sports department, you have your news department. When it comes to ESPN, everything is lumped into one. So if the winningest coach in college basketball history is available to be an analyst, I think you would sign him, right? If it would help your viewers. That doesn't mean you're condoning everything he's done in his career. But I tend to give John Dahl a lot of credit to say, hey, I want you to tell this story from a journalistic point of view. And it's not easy. ESPN knows they're going to get that question. Well, you hired this guy. Well, they didn't know everything I knew. And that's not to say they still wouldn't have hired him. I can't answer that. But as a basketball fan, does Coach Knight behind the mic breaking down a game, is there anybody better as far as a basketball mind? And again, people can judge whether he's great on TV or not. That's up to them. But, I give ESPN a lot of credit for having the courage to greenlight a film like this.
Last question for you, Robert, and thank you so much for being so generous with your time today. I want to bring it back to Neil Reed. And I wonder, if he were still alive today, do you think that he would have wanted this story told again? And what do you think he would have thought of Last Days of Knight?
A great question. I don't know the answer. He may not have, and I'm probably going to say he probably would not have wanted it told, because a lot of IU fans are going to have a hard time believing this. He wasn't interested in bringing attention to himself. If you could watch all the interviews I had done with him, I did one with him on the court down in New Orleans. I did one in the hotel, in his locker room. I did the one when he saw the tape. I did the one in a hotel. I think he wanted to get it out. And there's a photo in the film, if you look later, there's a photo of him in the film with a big smile on his face with a New York Yankees hat. And when I was out interviewing his wife, his widow, I walked by and that photo was sitting there. And I looked at it and I went, my eye immediately went to the date on the photo. And it was 5 days after I had interviewed him in New Orleans. Again, 9 months before I had talked to him, he finally went on camera with me, but the piece didn't air for another 5 weeks or so because I had to get the other players on camera. And it looks like the weight of the world is lifted off his shoulder. This, as you heard from his wife, it was always inside of him. It was always inside of him. I don't think he would have wanted to do it. And you can go on Twitter. There's a tweet, and I hope I get it right. It was in the film, was out of the film, was in the film, ultimately was out of the film. But 10 days before he passed, it was the height of the Jerry Sandusky trial. And he tweeted something to the effect of, now more than ever, I'm convinced that we're here to be punched, spit on, slapped, choked, and raped in the shower so a select few could be worshipped like gods. Mm. And when I read that tweet, oh my God, my heart sunk, because I actually thought Neil Reed died a miserable human being, and sadder than sad. And when I went out to California, as you guys saw, there could be nothing further from the truth. He was the Pied Piper to everybody he was with out there in California. And yet, what it told me is somewhere in the recesses of his brain or his heart, there was still the pain of what happened. And that's the one thing I hope you guys took and others took, that this isn't something he wanted. When he was 8 years old wanting to go to IU, he didn't want any part of it. He wanted to go there for 4 years. I mean, how tough is it to go to IU for 3 years and your degree's not from IU? You're not a letterman that's always welcome back. You're not always it broke his heart. He didn't want to be part of it, but it hurt him that badly. He felt like he had to leave. And then he felt like to move on with his life, he had to get it out. He had to get it out. I was the vehicle in which he got it out. He didn't come to me. I came to him. I didn't convince him to do it. I just waited until he was ready. And once he was finally ready, he told his story. And the word he kept coming back to is the truth. And there's a soundbite in the film where he goes, the only weapon I have to fight this battle with is the truth. And that's all Neil Reed was trying to do. He wasn't trying to hurt Coach Knight. He had no idea it would and neither did I, to be honest. I knew it would be a big story. I never knew the dominoes would fall the way they did. And I don't think he would want to relive it because, as you see in the film, I think he put it behind him. And I hope to God, if Coach Knight were to watch the film, I think he will. He won't admit that he will, but I think he will. Hopefully he can learn something from Neil Reed and put it behind him and move on and be happy, because it doesn't seem like he is, and that hurts me. I think it hurts everybody involved with IU basketball. Everybody kind of wants to move on, and I don't think he's allowed anyone to. Yeah. And I don't think he's moved on himself.
No, it certainly doesn't seem like it. I tell you, I don't tend to be very emotional when watching movies, and I had tears in my eyes watching those final scenes with Neil's family. It was really, like I said before, really compelling, really emotional, and I'm glad you told that story. I think it needed to be told.
Well, thank you, and I really saw your tweet the other day that you were skeptical, and I'm glad you put in the 102 minutes to watch it. And all I ask is for people to have an open mind, and it was never a hatchet job on Coach Knight. I hope you understand. Mm-hmm. If you go back through every track I have, I tried not to include my opinion or anything. I just said, this is exactly what happened. there's times where I was questioning Neil Reed throughout the film. I'm like, is he lying to me or not? Well, this guy said it. Well, do I believe Gary Donna? Do I believe this? Do I believe that? That's what a journalist goes through. And I didn't include the ending just for the emotional aspect. I just think I think it gave the film a heart and soul. And again, you can change the names. I'm the same way. If a kid leaves my team or we trade a player, if they're professional, whatever, we always just trash the person and we forget that they're kids. They're 17, 18, 19 years old, right? And as a coach, we can mold them into who we want. And I wish some people, including Coach Knight, got a control of his temper, his anger. And if the IU administration, if the fans, to your point, if the local media, and I didn't, at the time, I didn't quite understand zero tolerance, but I was hoping after that, I'm like, God, if he goes on to break the record here and all the greatness comes to the surface of Coach Knight and some of the negatives go by the wayside because he's getting one last chance, how great of a story would that have been? That he spends the next 4 or 5 years there, breaks the record, maybe gets to another Final Four or wins one. He could have ridden off into the sunset, but he just didn't make the most of that second chance.
No, and
it's sad. It's sad.
Well, and the thing is, he'd recruited a roster that would go on to the national title game 2 years later. And I guess you wonder if it would have had the same success with him, given what we had talked about with him kind of driving teams to the brink by the end of the season. But that's something that we'll never know, unfortunately.
Yeah, we'll never know. I know they played with a lot more freedom under Mike Davis during that run.
Yeah.
They just seemed like a happier team come the tournament, and they had energy, right? Nobody expected them to go on that run. They had something left in the tank, and for the past, 6 or 7 years, it didn't seem like they had much left in the tank when Coach Knight was coaching them. But you never know.
Yeah. Well, the film is The Last Days of Night. Again, you can watch it on ESPN Plus. We highly recommend that you do. Robert, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Robert.
Thanks for taking the time to watch the film, and I recommend everybody else to go. And I am a big supporter of IU. I want you guys to win a national championship so it can be put behind you, because I know there's a chasm between the Knight supporters and IU supporters, and that you got a great university, and I wish it wasn't that way, but yeah. I think if you can get back to the Final Four, hopefully it'll go by the wayside.
Hopefully. Well, thank you, Robert.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. To get more from me and from Alex, visit assemblycall.com and insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana University basketball. If you liked this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend or family member who loves IU basketball as much as you do. You can also support the show by leaving a rating and review on iTunes, which helps us get the word out to more IU fans like yourself. We will be back next week with a new episode. Until then, as always, go Hoosiers.